Welcome to episode 16 of Beneath the Grandstand. I'll tell you, Alex, when we got to 10, I thought it was a big deal. Now that I say 16, I was like, God, we don't have many of these episodes yet. We got to keep the train rolling. But Ryan Fenton here alongside Mr. Alex Lohr from afar. How you doing, Alex?
I'm good. I'm enjoying sports being, on the calendar right now. I'm like opening up my ESPN app and like Twitter, and I'm like seeing like real scores. Not that, some of the other sports that haven't kicked off yet aren't real sports, but personally, for me to open up Twitter and seeing, box scores from a Twins game is it just soothes my soul a little bit, and so I appreciate that moment. But I think, when we see all these sports kind of ramping up, it's important to talk about our sport contextually and maybe why it's not ramping up quite as quickly.
Right. Well, and even with sports, out there, one of the sports that I'm excited to see, partly because part of my role here at Flow Sports is overseeing cycling and our partnerships there. So cycling started this week, and that was great to see. But I think, talking about the MLB with Major League Baseball, the whole situation with the Marlins and them having to now sit out, it reminds you that, hey, sports are back if things continue to go well, right? And so, I look at cycling has started, right? And there's cycling as a sport that they've reformed the calendar for the season. The Tour de France is on there, the Giro d'Italia, all the big Grand Tours and all the, the big single day races are out there. But now that it's started, it's exciting, but I'm also nervous because I'm like, if one guy in the peloton gets infected, the whole thing's gone because everyone's got to self-quarantine. That cancels probably the next race. And, and so it's just, you're still fingers crossed. There's still an asterisk next to many things. So, but
if the Twins win the World Series, there will not be an asterisk next to that. I'm saying that right now. Okay. So forget your asterisks if the Twins win. Okay. If the Astros win, different story. Okay, total asterisk.
Well, as we take the view of sports happening, one of the sports that is not happening, as you referenced, is track and field in terms of the U.S. championships. Obviously, some smaller events and some kind of underground events, you might want to say, have popped up on short notice. But the U.S. championships was one that a lot of people were waiting to see. Will U.S. championships happen? It was just announced not too long ago that USATF would not host the meet this year, which is the first time in such a long time. And there was a lot of decisions that went into that, a lot of planning that went into that. And, Alex and I found ourselves talking to each other and asking others, man, what do you think happened? What was that like? And it finally clicked. We said, hey, why don't we ask? And so today's guest is coming in from USATF. It is Robert Chapman, who's the Director of Sports and Science and Medicine for USATF. He's also a professor at Indiana University, professor in the Exercise Science and Kinesiology department. He's been there for 11 years. He also has an interesting background because he was a coach at University of Indiana for a number of years, transitioned out of collegiate coaching and coached a post-collegiate professional elite team, Indiana Elite, you might remember. We got to work with him a number of years while in the early days of Flow Track while he was still coaching, and now excited to have him on the show in his current profession and role to really give us the insight on what goes into the decision on having an event, a USATF event in terms of the championships, sanctioning other events, and really the guidelines that have to be formed around all of this in order for anyone to have a competition safely. So with that said, let's welcome today's guest, Robert Chapman. Robert, great to have you on the show. And where are you at in the world and what's going on in your world today?
Sure. Well, normally I'm in Bloomington, Indiana or Indianapolis, where the USATF national offices are, either my campus office at Indiana University or there. But today I'm actually in Chicago. My son has to move apartments at the end of the month. And so I came up here to be a good dad, help him move. And joking around is, of course, his apartment's on the third floor. get all his stuff down, and now his new apartment's on the 3rd floor. So I've used muscles I haven't used in a long time, but I got the pandemic pump going right now, so I'm doing all right.
I moved so many times over the course of a short number of years, and then one time I finally pulled the trigger and hired some movers, and I've never looked back since.
Yeah, my wife and I were talking. I'm like, why don't we just hire somebody? But I'm trying to be a good dad. So.
Well, cool. Well, we appreciate you joining us, and know it's been a long day for you, but really would love to talk about the recent events of trying to not only figure out what track meets look like, but how do people have track meets, and then how does the governing body USATF try to have their own U.S. championship, which obviously recently we all heard will not happen this year. But I guess first off, where can you kind of set the groundwork for your role at USATF, and then specifically your role within the COVID-19 situation?
Sure. So at USATF, I'm the director of sports science and medicine. Normally, my job is centered around how can we use, obviously, sports medicine, sports science principles to help athletes achieve peak performance and win medals. It's all about medal attainment. With COVID, it is pivoted quite drastically over to what I would call more public health sort of guidance for the organization. Now we're talking about athlete health and safety and wellness. Health, wellness, and safety are the three things we're focused on right now. So with COVID, one of the first things that I was tasked with in March, when things started picking up drastically, is we needed to put together a group of experts. So we established a COVID-19 working group. It's got 6 MDs and 2 PhDs on the group, which I'm one of. We have experts we have an infectious disease epidemiology expert who has $5+ million in grants from the NIH and sends her models to the CDC all the time. We have the chief medical officer for the U.S. Olympic Committee. We have the vice president of sports medicine for the NBA. We have both team physicians for USATF for the Olympic Games in Tokyo. So just a really accomplished group who both understand the sport and the nuances involved in the sport, but also understand the unique things that we face with this pandemic and the decisions we have to make to keep everybody safe.
So when you're assembling all of these minds from different kind of parts of the world within science and within sport, what's the goal? What's that first meeting like together? And what are you trying to figure out in kind of a world of a lot of unknowns?
Yeah, this one was a little different than what I think a normal situation might have been when you bring together a group of experts for guidance, because things were moving very, very quickly. And we needed to give the organization some extremely quick guidance in a very quick time frame. It wasn't long after we met. I think we had met 3 or 4 times, 3 or 4 days in a row. And I think by day 5, we had to make the decision to suspend all events for the organization, close down the national office essentially as well. So there wasn't a lot of, hey, how you doing, pleasantries. It was, okay, you're an expert in this, you're an expert in this, you're an expert in this. Let's go through this list of things, and we've got to move right now on these key things. And the group did a great job. Now from there, we were able to pivot and spend time more. Then we got to the next part. Once we did that, we could catch our breath. More information started coming in about the virus, and then it became, all right, eventually we're going to see the world open up again. And once we get to that point, we need to have guidance on return to play, return to practice, and then we need to have event hosting guidelines. And so that was the next step for the group. Once we got over kind of the acute things that we had to do for the organization, then it became, all right, let's put together that guidance for once we're able to, how do we do it? What does practice look like? What sort of criteria and risk management things are involved with that so that we can, try to move back to the sport.
Hey, Robert, I'd love to know, you're talking about, the guidance on the return to sport. Just, the group that you mentioned, I guess, where were they working backwards from? Like, who were those guidelines coming from? Were they government organizations? And then when you're looking at data and you're with the amount of information that's out there, like, who was your main source for information? And so the guideline, because the guidelines come, from one place, but then the data and the facts come from another place. Can you tell us kind of like what that funnel of information looked like?
Sure. So the group, when we started, we said, okay, the first thing we have to realize is that we're unique among sports in that we're not just a team in one place. We're not the New York Jets. We're not anything like that. We are literally 50 states all over, everything from elite athletes to masters to youth, you name it, across the board. So we knew it couldn't be a one-size-fit-all recommendation. So we had to start, and we made the decision to start with, we need to start with the local and state public health guidance. So that became step one, is you need to determine what was the situation in your state, both in terms of the outbreak of the virus, but also in terms of what is your state and local public health authority recommending when it comes to whether it's shelter in place, whether it is will allow events of this particular size, things like that. So state and local guidance became number one. Then we said, all right, what's next is what authority are we going to trust? And we made a very quick and easy decision that we were going with the CDC. CDC guidelines were number one and paramount. We were going to follow those guidelines explicitly. From then, the next layer became, okay, how do we take the CDC guidelines and state and local guidance, which may vary all over the country in every place, and how do we tease out the unique nature of doing track, whether it's practice or whether it's meets? So from that next step, what we did is we based a lot of our decisions on the USOPC put out a guidance statement where they stratified different events by risk. And they were looking at all the sports. So they were looking at everything from downhill skiing to track to swimming to you name it, and gave examples of what they considered to be low risk, moderate risk, and high risk. So we looked at those and we said, all right, what makes sense within track that fits with low risk? What needs to be classified or stratified as moderate risk? What needs to be high risk in terms of virus transmission? Once we had that down, then we had to say, all right, once we know what category you're in, then what criteria do you need to meet to be cleared to participate in that particular low, moderate, or high risk event, whether it's practice, whether it's a competition, and what does that screening and clearance criteria look like? So those are kind of the steps that we went through in terms of decision making and putting this all together.
It's pretty crazy to think about because, like as you said, we're not, the sport of track and field isn't just certain teams, 30 teams around the country, where they practice, where they play, you can isolate, right. A number of things, or you can just move everybody to Florida and figure it out. Right. And so not only is there the dynamic of, the level of athlete, right? Elite, masters, youth, you name it. You also have cross country, you have roads, you have indoor track, you have outdoor track. And then within that, obviously different distances and whatnot. And then just in track and field alone, 19 or 20 individual events that all have specific specifications. So
absolutely,
there's a lot there. So there's a lot, right? And so I guess where do you start? You get this USOPC, kind of risk levels. Right. Where do you start?
Yep. So Obviously, I think where you start with is we said, all right, there's three primary ways the virus is believed by the CDC to be able to be transmitted. One is respiratory droplets. One is contact with infected surfaces. And then the third one, which we know the least about, is what is called aerosols, respiratory aerosols that linger in the air that aren't droplets. Droplets fall to the ground within 2 meters. That's why you have the 2 meters or 6 feet distance rule. But aerosols may stay in the air a lot longer, but it may be a smaller dose. And so how do you balance all these things out when it comes to risk? So we started with, okay, what events can be done in a socially distant manner? So now we take the respiratory droplets out of the equation. What can be done where you don't have to contact things, whether they are implements, whether they are a high jump mat, whether they are starting blocks, whether they're relay batons, things like that. And then what events can you not socially distance with or have this aerosol potential transmission that you can't avoid? And so that's where we had to look and say, okay, within each event, okay, here's how you can modify a shot put to make it low risk. If you can do it in a socially distanced manner, you take care of the respiratory droplet piece. We're not worried about aerosols because we're not really running and breathing heavy and moving through space, but what about touching things? So now it became, okay, are we going to allow officials to retrieve the implements for the athletes or not? And we made the decision that for low risk for those type of events, the athlete would have to retrieve their own implement. No sharing of implements would be used. So if you were willing to make those modifications, you could be classified as low risk. And there's an advantage in being low risk because that had the lowest barrier of entry, if you will, to be able to get into the meet or get into practice, if you will, and be cleared for that activity. Now you pivot over to things like distance running, where the nature of the event itself doesn't allow you to freely socially distance. So if I'm running a 1500, if I'm running a 10K, I can't necessarily make the choice on my own to always stay 6 feet away from somebody else. So that's one issue. The other issue, and we spent a lot of time looking at the issue of aerosols, and there's not a lot of data on it, but we found as much as we could, and there's data that suggests that when an athlete is running at a moderate pace, that they can leave, I'm going to call it a vapor trail, behind them of aerosols that can be as much as 20 to 25 meters long. So now you're talking about, even when you're more than 6 feet away, you know, and you need to think about when somebody's running, they're ventilating 150, 180, 200 liters a minute. So that's a pretty high dose, if you will, of respiratory droplets, aerosols going into the air. So even if they're really small, you're running behind that catching those. We felt that we had to put all the distance events that weren't running lanes into the moderate risk category. That means a higher barrier to be able to get in and do the meet. So that's kind of how the decision making worked on that.
Hey, Robert, I'd just like to, maybe level set for folks, and this might be a little elementary here, but there used to be, and some justify, but it's outside. I thought we were okay if we were outside. I guess, like, where did those limitations not come up to the, I guess, CDC standard? Because you see across the board, like, people justify not wearing masks outside, or they justify masks being outside.
Right.
Where does that no longer become valid in kind of your decision-making process?
The inside versus outside, we really couldn't necessarily say, okay, just because you're outside and maybe the wind's blowing, we're going to take this away. Because, again, you can't see where the virus is. If it was visible, that's one thing, but we can't see it. And so we've got the CDC doesn't necessarily make a distinction. I had somebody, believe me, in my role, you wouldn't believe the emails and phone calls that I get of people who want to argue. No matter what we decided to do, we were going to make half the people feel we weren't doing enough to protect people, and half the people felt like we were overreaching and, hey, I'm an adult, I can make my own decision, do what I want. But we have a responsibility to try to keep people safe, but you also have to realize once we put together our guidance, we had it done, and it took quite a while to get through. Basically, the lawyers and the insurance company are the ones who will ultimately have to sign off on this, because what we're talking about is risk management, right? At the end of the day, what level of risk is acceptable? And we came up and said, this amount of risk is acceptable for us to do. And then we had to have lawyers and everybody else make a decision on that. But one of the arguments that I had with somebody is they said, so, when you look at the CDC guidelines for close contact, the CDC guidelines are if you're inside of 6 feet or 2 meters for longer than 15 minutes, they consider to be close contact. And that's where contact tracing, if you're that close to an infected person, that's where you make that decision if you need to quarantine. He said, so his logic was, well, 15 minutes, gosh, I can run a 3,200 meters. I can run a 1,500. I can run an 800. And I'm not, even if I was running right next to somebody, it's not 15 minutes. And I had to remind him that the saying I always have is dose matters when we talk about this virus. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, the dose matters. When the CDC said that 6 feet for 15 minutes, that's somebody breathing at rest. That's about 5 liters of ventilation a minute. If I'm running right next to you at maximal exercise, I'm probably going to put out about 180 liters a minute, give or take a little bit. So now you're talking about 30, 40, 50 times the ventilatory dose. Even if I'm running right next to you to 2 minutes, you're getting 50 times the dose for 2 minutes. You follow me? So this is where, you can't really parse out too much the inside outside. You got to make decisions to keep people safe and stay with those CDC guidelines.
With the events that you guys examined, Robert, it sounds like the distance events were challenging and we're putting that high category, but what other events were challenging to figure out as you guys went through this?
Sure. So the distance events are in the moderate category. And again, I want to go to low and moderate risk, the criteria you got to do to get in. The advantage of low risk is that then to get in, you only have to do a symptom survey and a temperature check prior to the practice or prior to the competition. So that's, relatively speaking, a lower barrier of entry that is doable for a lot of meets. The distance events ended up being where they were in the moderate risk category. And in the moderate risk category, we had to go with the CDC. They actually defined for a group of people that have a certain type of exposure, and professional athletes are included. It also includes like first responders, police, firefighters, military, things like that. So those actually have to have 2 negative COVID-19 PCR tests that are separated by a minimum of 24 hours and done within 7 days of the event. And if you come back negative on those 2 PCR tests within 7 days, then you are essentially cleared for a 7-day window from the date of the first test to compete. The other events that we really struggled with, or that we spent a lot of time discussing, were the vertical jumps, the high jump and pole vault. And the discussion mainly centered around, what do you do with the landing mats? Can you adequately disinfect a landing mat? Because there's concerns about transfer through contact with infected surfaces. So we ended up originally the guidelines from that was argued was, we just can't do it. Can't have pole vault, can't have high jump. We worked out a compromise where we said, all right, what if we got a vinyl tarp, like something you get at Walmart, Target, that you go camping with, put it on, and every athlete either has their own tarp, or you have 2 or 3 tarps that after each jump, you take it off, you put a new one on, and you disinfect the tarp that somebody just came in contact with. And we actually got that to be okayed and approved. It may sound like it's a hassle, but again, you got to remember the alternative is we don't have the event. So even our high jumpers and pole vaulters realized very quickly, okay, it's a hassle to do this, but if it's going to keep me safe and going to allow these meets to be sanctioned and move forward, then we'll do it.
Robert, the actual press release about, officially no USATF championship this year came out on, I think, July 20th. I'm wondering what actually prompted the kind of press send or the official kind of like red light, this is not happening? Like, did we reach like a deadline, or did we get to a point where there was like one barrier that was just too much that kind of finally broke the camel's back?
Sure. So I don't want people to think that we just kept putting it off and put it off. We started in April having discussions about outdoor nationals, and we started developing different contingency plans for what a nationals could look like. And there were a lot of different ideas about how to do it in a safe way. Do we break it up? Do we go to a smaller meet? How can we get this done? So there was a lot of time and meetings and efforts put in with multiple contingencies. What we ended up getting to was first off, we needed to wait to see what the virus is doing. You know, if you think what the virus is doing today, you can predict what it's going to be. I'm going to give you an example. So people would always come in May saying, you got to make a decision. You got to make a decision about what's going to happen in September, you know, or August for a meet 2 months down the road. And I would say back in May, well, just go 2 months backwards and look at where we were and how we thought about the virus. You're literally throwing darts at the dartboard if you think you can predict where this virus is going to go. So all the decisions had to be made with, okay, we're going to do these things, but we have no idea what the virus situation is going to be down the road, and we may need to change things. But what we got to is to a point where we said, all right, we can do an event in a certain manner, and we felt we could keep the athletes while they did the event safe or at a manageable level of risk, meaning we could run a shot put, we could run a long jump, we could run 100, we could run a 1500. We could do those in a way where we felt we could keep the risk of virus transmission between athletes in that event at a low enough level that we can move forward. The ultimate decision came down to not that, but when you talk about a national championships, even a reduced size, you're talking about a 1,000 to 1,200 person mass gathering event. And ultimately, did we feel comfortable having a 1,000, 1,200 person mass gathering event where everybody's going to have to travel in to get to that site? That was where we felt the risk was too high, is bringing all those people together where they had to travel from out of town. They're going to be in a confined area with a lot of people for an extended period of time. That ended up being really, I think, the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of the ultimate decision, is we felt we couldn't keep people safe in that particular situation. Then on top of that, even if we move forward, we haven't even talked about all the logistical hurdles that we would have to get through, which were substantial and significant. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we just didn't feel comfortable having a 1,200 person event where people had to travel in to get there and do it. It just wasn't the right decision.
I want to kind of jump into some of the logistics around that you referenced, but before we do, you know, going back to one thing you said around testing, you said, you know, for athletes that are competing in a moderate risk event, you have to have 2 tests within 24 hours within 7 days of the event. And so kind of a question for USATF looking at their own meet, and then also for other events out there that are trying to host events or host meets right now. You know, a lot of the testing turnaround time that you're hearing around the country is it's taking up to 2 weeks. So does that, you know, one, how do we have the standard of 7 days and actually fit within it, or do meets just actually not have a chance if it's going to take 2 weeks to get results back? Like, how do you navigate those waters?
Yeah. All right. So a couple things there. First is where does the 7 days come from? And the 7 days does come from the CDC. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is that this virus has very unique timing when it comes to the point that you get infected, the time it takes to incubate, and the point at which you test positive. It can vary from as short as a window as about 72 hours, 3 days, to as long as 14 days. And that's why that 14-day quarantine window is what it is. So the 7-day period of time is, all right, if we test you on day 0 and you test negative, we feel there's a certain level of risk, again, risk moderation of allowing you to compete within that window where you won't be contagious, even if you are asymptomatic and get it after that time. So the time frame is based on the incubation period, the typical incubation period of the virus from when you get infected. When it comes to the testing turnaround time, we do have an advantage in that we have partnered through our colleagues at the USOPC with a lab in Salt Lake City, Utah. It's a sports medicine research and testing laboratory. They're doing all the testing for Major League Baseball, a number of the pro sports, all the Olympic sports. It's a saliva-based PCR test, which is an advantage because you don't have to basically have the Q-tip poked into your brain to get the samples. We can ship the samples in saliva, capture the saliva in a test tube, box it up, ship it. If we overnight ship it, it arrives 10:30 the next morning. They analyze it that day and get the results back to us that night. So we've got the turnaround as short as we can possibly make it. The only problem is the availability of that test. We can only make it available to qualified tier and talent protection program athletes because this is a USOC funded program. And to be honest, it's very expensive. Our cost is about $100 a test, not including the shipping costs of overnight shipping. So that was another factor ultimately that came into a national championships is, if we wanted to test every athlete and test the officials and others who'd be at moderate risk, to do everybody, it was going to be over $200,000 just in the testing costs. You add on top of that, everybody would have had to arrive at the location a minimum of 3 days early, and that we would have had to put everybody in single rooms, no sharing rooms except with immediate family members. Now you're at $500,000 before you blink.
And this is just at U.S. championships.
That's just the U.S. championships.
Yeah.
So,
so on the on the testing piece, in terms of the timeline, I mean, one of in the conversations that we've had with athletes and event directors trying to navigate these waters and just people in general, because these are kind of some guidelines that are certain states you have to be tested before you go into the state to avoid self-quarantine, all these things. Right. So one of the common questions is around that timing. And it's if I get a test or 2 tests, 7 days, 5 days before I get to a place, but then I travel to that actual place, I go through an airport, right. I'm using the facilities, eating food.
Absolutely.
Isn't there a chance I'm still going to get infected and the tests I took before I left to go are irrelevant? Is that actually the case, or is there something not accurate with that thought?
Well, you're partially correct in that. Absolutely, in a perfect world, we would test people on site after they've traveled. We would test people after they've had the greatest potential exposure risk, and then we would test them. Again, still the issue with timing is you could travel today, get the virus today in the airport, get there, and it may be another 8 or 10 days before that virus incubates to the point where both you're viral shedding and you test positive, right? So that's where the 7-day window, even if you do it before you leave, gives us a little bit of leeway in terms of it, when you're playing the odds. If you're negative on that date, even if the minute after you give the test, you're exposed to the virus, if you play the odds, the chances are you're not going to be viral shedding in that window enough to where we feel like you're a risk in doing that. I'll tell you what, in a perfect world, what we would do is we would travel everybody into a site that had to travel to compete. We would quarantine them for 5 days. And that's actually what the USOPC does, is if you go to the Olympic Training Center, you come in, they quarantine you for 5 days before they even test you. That would be kind of an ideal scenario that we'd follow, but it's just not practical. At the end of the day, that's why we are supportive of events that take place within a certain guideline. You've seen these what I'll call more inter squad type meets pop up They've had sprint meets in Orlando and Texas. You've seen the distance meets in Portland. These are 30, 40 person meets. They can be done in a socially distanced manner. The people who are competing in them, for the most part, aren't traveling to get there. That's the safest form of competition right now.
Robert, I have a question about the actual availability of testing, and I know there's now in the end of July, it feels like there's a little more resourcing around availability of testing, and understood that you were working with a specific lab in Salt Lake City that was servicing some of the other professional organization or professional athlete organizations. But did you ever run into like an optics challenge from the standpoint of, hey, we are using all these tests and we are pulling tests out of what's available to the general public for these athletes? Was that ever a challenge, like an optics or kind of like a moral compass to decide whether these sort of testing parameters were appropriate?
Yeah, we never ran into that sort of criticism. Again, the volume of testing that we're doing using this protocol is extremely low. I mean, we've probably in the time we've been doing it, we've done probably less than 150 tests, I would say, over the whole time. Where I personally and where our organization is challenged right now is, okay, let's say we want to have the Ryan Fenton inter squad meet. And he's going to have 30 people that already live. Are you in Austin right now? You still in Austin?
I am.
I'm not sure where you are now. So let's say in Austin, and Texas is wide open right now, right? You could have 250 people maybe. I don't know what the current state and local guidance is in Austin, but you could probably have a big meet. What we'd prefer you do is that you have a small meet. 30 people is just fine. No fans, minimal coaches. Bring the athletes in, do low risk events, do your symptom survey, do your temperature check, and the athletes who compete are all local. That would be great. Where we struggle, where I personally struggle in my role with USATF, and I think where our organization does struggle, is when you talk about these mass gathering, large events where people travel in from out of town, particularly in states where I think those of us in the medical community might say, I wish the state was a little more conservative in terms of the limits and the guidance that they give, but the state happens to be a little more wide open. Those are ones where I think we feel really challenged as an organization, and I'm trying to push people not to necessarily look at having meets in those situations, even if they're allowed to under the rules of the state or even with our guidance. I'm trying to get them to see the wiser choice. So you're gonna have the Ryan Fenton Invitational with 300 people, then we need to have a call.
You will be the first one that picked up the phone for it.
Yeah, I'm going to give you a call on that one.
Robert, I do have a question about that balance, right? Because it's like, I'm sure that, there's been people have tossed out Texas. People might say North Dakota, South Dakota. Why don't you have it there? They don't have any guidelines. But there is also, again, that balance from your perspective of a medical professional that says, yeah, there's reasons that we don't want to go there, and those lack of guidelines are exactly the cause. And I guess, right. Have you been battling those arguments over the last few weeks?
I wouldn't call them battles at all. I have concerns that we start with state and local guidance, right? The state and local public health guidance is the number one step. If you look at our event hosting guidance on our webpage, it is step number one. Determine what your local state public health guidance is. I struggle because we have many states in the country that if the goal is risk mitigation for people, I wish they would be personally a little more conservative and a little more tighter on those guidelines. We've had discussions. Can we make our guidance tighter than that? And that's a bigger discussion.
I want to go back to some of the logistics you referenced around trying to plan a USATF championships. Even with what you were just saying around how different cities and states have different guidelines, where did you guys start in terms of, LOCs or cities or venues that were on the list of options? Like, what were the options that you guys considered?
Yeah, and that was really outside of my particular working group's area of expertise, as well as our scheduling group. We left that up to Adam Schmank, who's our director of events, who does a great job trying to reach out to see which different venues might be interested in doing it. Certainly, there was an attraction if it was in a place where a lot of people could drive to and didn't have to fly. So something centrally rather than coastal would have made sense, but that didn't necessarily, if you were on the coast, didn't exclude somebody from being considered for that at all. It's just such a challenge when you talk about a national championship event. Something else to consider is that that we talked about is, okay, let's say you travel in 1,200 people, and you look at the asymptomatic positive rate. Now we're talking about probably somewhere between 15 and 30 people would test positive, would be asymptomatic and test positive of those 1,200 that we tested. So now what do you do with those individuals? They immediately need to quarantine for 14 days. We need to do contact tracing. And with everybody who's there, now you might have their whole training group gets knocked out. How do you travel them home? Because as soon as somebody tests positive, it has to be reported to the state public health authority, and they're required by law to notify TSA. And so now you wouldn't want to get on an airplane, but even if they tried to, they wouldn't. What if they're 2,000 miles from home? Now what do? They're stuck for 14 days. These are all things that went into the calculus for us trying to figure it out.
And what's maybe what are some other on the logistics side of thinking about a venue and a place? So you have people traveling in, you have people when they're there, right. If they get sick, how is that going to be handled? What other things have to be considered in a year like this that normally you're not having to consider?
Sure. Well, you also have to consider what's the motivation of an LOC to do the extreme effort and cost to host the championship. What they want to do, basically, they're getting revenue from three places. They're getting heads in beds. They're getting tax revenue from people eating in restaurants and things like that. But then there's ticket sales for fans. And almost assuredly, we would be in a scenario where we would not have fans in the venue, or if we did, it would be extremely limited, but most likely no fans. So now, what's the motivation for an LOC to want to bid for that situation, and also say, oh yeah, bring your 1,200 people and all their cooties in from out of town. That's great. Come on and do that. So those were all challenges.
Cooties, that's the technical term
that's the official term. Yeah.
Robert, we've been talking a lot about the athletes and the protocols that they have to go through, but I think anyone knows that what actually props up a real track and field event is the support team around it, such as the volunteers, the officials. Can you tell us how much coordinating their support and bringing those folks in amplifies the challenge?
Sure. So obviously, to do all the things we would have needed to do, the medical support staff would be huge. We would have had to have had a partner with a local medical center that in our medical response plan, if people did test positive, that would be the kind of the triage facility for that. You've got to screen everybody who walks in the facility. That is a burden that's huge. But then again, you talk about just the number of officials that it takes to run a track meet. We even went to the length of doing a deep dive on the schedule and say, how could we do a session 1, session 2, session 3 throughout the day spread the events out so that we could minimize the number of official crews that we needed. Because the reality is most of our official crews, most of our officials are of a certain age where now they fall into the CDC risk factor, which the CDC lists above age 65 as being at greater risk with this. So now it's just another factor that becomes involved. And then you have to make the decision. Right now, our guidance does not bar people from the facility if they meet the CDC risk criteria. So the CDC lists on their website 11 specific criteria that consider them to be at higher than normal risk. Age is one of them. You've seen immunosuppressed. You've seen BMI, obesity, heart disease, kidney disease, things like that. We haven't, in our guidance, it's recommended that those people don't participate. But when it comes to our national championships, now we'd have to make the decision, okay, are we going to bar those individuals or not? Think about, we've got a number of podium level coaches who are above the age of 65. Do we now not let them into the facility to coach their athletes? Again, we've got 3 different pages, if you will, of issues like this that just, made the hurdle too high, no pun intended, for us to get over.
In terms of the financial impact of an event like this for the costs that go into this, you already mentioned 200 to 500,000 in testing and hotels alone just to make the that part possible for the athletes. I mean, what is the gap or the difference in the financials on an event like this in a COVID year versus a non-COVID year?
Yeah, it's a good question, and that's maybe a little above my pay grade to answer. That's something that's definitely in Adam Schmenk's wheelhouse. I tried to stay focused on the medical and science side of how do we do this and keep the risk low enough that we keep people safe, and just the cost there before you blink were going to be probably about $600,000-$700,000 just to do all the testing, all the extra hotel rooms, all the medical staff. Now, on top of that, you get into the costs of actually doing the event itself that Adam and his team do such a great job with. He could tell you, and I'm sure it's multiples of that.
So just on the health side alone, it's north of $500,000 that would go into an event this year. Yeah,
and that's conservative. That's conservative. I can get there with 2 factors alone, So, and I want to be clear: are our athletes worth it? Is doing a national championship worth that cost? Absolutely. If we needed to find the money, do I have a belief that our CEO and our president and everyone else in the organization could have found the money? Sure. I'm conjecturing here, but I bet they would have found a way to do it. The bigger issue was the health, safety, and wellness of everybody involved coming to this meet. And that, at the end of the day, that was the number one deciding factor where, you have all these other things going on, but at the end of the day, that made it an easy call. An unfortunate call, but an easy call.
Is there, now that the call has been made, the announcement was out, I'm sure you guys got response. I'm sure there's positive and negative that comes with that. Is there anything now that you look back on and say, we maybe could have figured this out, or, there's no way really there to avoid the risks that we saw in front of us?
I think absolutely the second. I don't think there has been 1 second of second guessing on our part. It was absolutely the right call. I think when people sit down and really look at it, it was the right call. And consider we made it then, and look at where the virus numbers are now, in terms of the way things are going. So, at the end of the day, I don't think there's been any second guessing at all taking place like that. Are people disappointed? Of course. Do you want to have a national championship? Of course. We've had it for how many years? 150? Something like that. It's a lot, and of course you want to do it, and it's disappointing not to, but you got to make the right call.
We lost your volume, Al.
Hey, sorry about that. Robert, it sounds like you guys explored every possible venue and every kind of scenario to make this thing happen, and you played them out. I'm curious though. We still have there's still some events on the calendar. For instance, there's the Monaco meet is still technically on the calendar right now, and there's some excitement around that. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, is there a limitation or a guideline that they don't have to face that's allowing them to make this happen?
When you talk about World Athletics events and things like that, so Diamond Leagues and other events that are taking place in Europe right now. Well, so Stefan Berman is the medical director for World Athletics. He's a good friend. He does a great job. He's the counterpart for World Athletics for what I do for USA Track and Field. And I'll say he's higher up the food chain than I am. He's brilliant, and I aspire to be able to do half the things he does. But seriously, though, he's got a very stringent set of criteria for World Athletics events to be able to take place. Certainly one of the advantages right now, if you look at what's going on in Europe with the virus numbers, they are nowhere near what they are in the U.S. Just to give you an idea, there are more positive cases every day in the state of Florida than there are in the entire European continent right now. That's the way the numbers are trending. So from a safety standpoint, according to their guidelines, those events have been able to meet them. They have very stringent testing protocols as well. We do have some U.S. athletes that are going, and I'm trying to help them navigate and figure it out. And Renee Charpentier, who's the meet director at Monaco, we email about twice a day and over the last week trying to figure out how we can get athletes tested and get done what they need to do. For the ones who do want to make that decision, that they do want to get on the airplane and go over and compete.
Robert, I'm curious what are some of those major, because from what everybody hears on this side is like, Americans aren't even almost allowed to leave or enter any of these countries. How can U.S. athletes be competing right now? Like, what are the gates they have to go through?
Yeah, and I don't want to speak authoritatively because I don't know all of them. I do know that to fly, they have to have a negative COVID test that is sampled within 72 hours of the departure of their flight from the U.S. And so that's made things a little tricky, even for us with our, quick turnaround lab in Utah to help them, simply because of the time it takes to FedEx the samples, get the report, and the fact that the lab isn't open on Saturday and Sunday, and they all want to leave on Sunday. So that means we got to test them on Thursday, and what time's your flight leave? And it's like a puzzle, putting it all together. Wow. Again, I don't mean to be an expert on this. I think the majority of them are flying to London first because London is not in the EU. They are separate now. And so they're allowed to transit through London, and that makes it allowable. I think a lot of them do have documentation from the Monaco meet director and the ambassador from Monaco, so that when they land in Nice, they are there on essentially work assignment, and they have that letter from the ambassador. I think those are the ways, that's my understanding of how they're taking those steps.
And Robert, on some of the meet, you mentioned some of the smaller meets that are popping up, and those are kind of the avenues for a lot of the athletes, to try to compete right now, because the Diamond League is obviously limited in general in terms of space for U.S. athletes, right? And then so a lot of the athletes are trying to figure out ways to compete here. For looking at some of those smaller meets, we talked a lot about USATF trying to put on their championship. What challenges are different for the smaller meets than that are kind of putting this on and trying to get sanctioned through USATF versus actually being the governing body to put on the event?
Yeah, so first off, USATF actually doesn't put on a lot of events. We put on our national championship, but then everything else is done independently by LOCs, and we sanction those events. The biggest barrier is not necessarily on our end with the sanction. From what we found, the biggest barrier has been getting access to facilities. In a lot of locations, you have a lot of meet directors simply can't get access to a track. I actually got a call yesterday from Jesse Williams out in California, who, put on the Sunset Tour last year, and he was excited because he'd actually found a facility that was going to allow him in California to have a meet, and he's been shut out of every place else that he's asked to try to have this meet. So, access to facilities has been number one. Once people get access to facilities, then the sanction really becomes a big issue because there's liability insurance attached to it. And that's one of the key reasons why people do want sanctions, not only to have the NGB's stamp of approval, have our approval that the marks, if it's done according to the rules, will count and be recognized by our federation and others, but the liability insurance that comes attached with it is a big deal to those facilities and to the meet directors as well. But facility access has been the key hurdle.
Robert, even once we get past, the venue access, right? It seems like a lot of these meets kind of get ramped up almost, within a couple of days, because let's say, we recognize that an athlete is ready to, pop a big race, right? We know they're fit, they're ready to rip. So right. You're also under a timeline, right? Where it's like, I would love to know the timeline, I guess, behind getting sanctioned from the time that, a coach raises a flag and says, my athlete is ready to run. My athlete is ready to break a big record, right? To the time that USATF stamps of approval, like, game on, your sanction. Like, what does that timeline actually look like especially for some of these new pop-up meets?
Sure. And again, I'm not the authoritative expert on this, but I'll tell you that applying for a sanction actually starts with your association. So the sanction, when you go and apply on the USATF website for a sanction and you hit submit, it actually goes to the local association where the meet is going to be held. And then that local association sanction officer looks through, make sure everything's in order in terms of the rules, the paperwork, all the I's dotted, T's crossed on the application. Once that's good, they hit approve or deny. And typically my understanding is they only deny if there's something missing in the application that needs to be done. It goes to the national office, and we have a staff member there full time that all he does is process sanctions. His name's Tyler Nelson, and he has done an absolutely fantastic job, particularly with these elite events, because we do know they're under the gun. Once they hit his desk, he turns them around quickly and then gets the certificate of insurance from our insurer back to be able to give to the venue. And in some cases, I think they've been able to turn those around if the association person is like, hey, listen, I'm going to have this meet. Can you be ready? I'm hitting send on my application now if you happen to be able to contact them, and they're able to turn around quick. I think we've been able to do it in like 48 hours and get some turned around that quickly. I don't think that's typical, but I think in some of these cases it's been able to have that done.
Yeah. And how do they, like, what's required for you? Like, what does USATF need to see from a health and safety side to put that stamp of approval and have that insurance available?
Sure. I can't speak to the whole application. I don't know it well enough to speak on that, but I will say as far as our event hosting guidelines from the COVID standpoint, again, they have to follow all the steps of our event hosting guidelines. They also have to have what's called a medical response plan that they prepare. And that's based on a number of factors, including the facility, what the current breakout or COVID situation is in that particular area of the country, what they're doing in terms of screening athletes, procedures, what they do to keep the venue safe, what they're doing to, if an athlete does have a high temperature or shows symptoms, how do they respond, things like that. So they have to have that whole medical response plan in place and follow that. And if they don't, they run the risk of having the sanction voided.
Got it.
Robert, you're a former coach. You've been on. I mean, you've been in the game, and you know what a beast. Sometimes it is to get those times knocked out and get qualifying marks and things like that. And I think it's interesting, given this, the 2020 has maybe shifted our perspective on, what's possible to even host an event. You mentioned that you've seen sanctioning happening within 48 hours. And we've seen it happen, especially like with the Bowerman Group. They've been able to capitalize on, reading the athlete's current fitness and then being able to capitalize on that. I'm curious, from your kind of coaching background, like, are we able to now start kind of reframing how we set up our competitive schedules now that we know that we can get a high quality meet off the ground quickly? What does that do for a coach and an athlete from a perspective of planning and kind of capitalizing on fitness? It kind of flips our perceptions a little bit from working backwards from a big meet to, hey, if you're ready to race, we're going to put something together.
It's a really fascinating question. I think there's a lot of nuance to it, though, because you're absolutely right. When Jerry was looking at putting on the meet in Portland, he knew Shelby was fit. Shelby knew she was going to break the American record. I think Jerry also knew she was going to do it. I think he knew Carissa was going to run really fast, and maybe not as fast as she did. But he felt, she was certainly that fit and wanted to try to get this meet scheduled and timed perfectly. Just to give you an idea, there was some unique situation, and Jerry his memory might be a little better than mine, but we couldn't get testing or get the track, or he had problems getting the track and actually kept his athletes at altitude, I think about 8 or 9 days longer. So they were ready to leave. He couldn't get the track or something came up. So he had to actually make the arrangements because he didn't want them to go to Portland and be at sea level for that chunk of time. He wanted them to race, and altitude training is my particular area of expertise as a scientist. So I've worked with Jerry a lot in terms of, trying to help him and others develop these protocols of how high you live, how long you stay, when you come down for a major race. And Jerry's done a great job, and he's got it wired now. And they know exactly for Shelby how she runs and responds best from coming down. So they actually had to stay at altitude another, I think, 8 or 9 days before they brought her down, because that was the nature of them getting the facility. The other nuance, though, the reality of the question is, on one hand, it was a great thing. Shelby ran fast. A lot of those athletes ran fast and ran PRs, but it's also unfortunate that she had to do it at a high school track in Portland, wouldn't you say? And it wasn't at a major competition that could get a lot of eyeballs on it for her training group, for the sport, for her various sponsors. I'm sure they would have liked to seen it in a different venue, but the unique times called for unique situation, and Jerry and his group were able to put it together for her.
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, it's the dynamic of that. I mean, the Michael Norman 986, all these things that are just kind of popping off, and it's almost like if you're not following social media on an hourly basis each day, you miss something, and all of a sudden,
not missing it. Yeah.
Yeah. You said, what happened yesterday, and where did it happen? So yeah, I think it's a good point. That's, and then we kind of go down a road of the marketing and promotion of all these things, and it's awesome to see, but it's unfortunate that more people aren't getting to see it and experience it, whether in person or live, whatever it might be. So, where do we go from here, Robert, in terms of, as you guys look ahead, the 2020 season is essentially canceled, more or less.
Right.
So where do you go from here in terms of saying how this is the next event we're planning, or how do we start even thinking about what that next event might be?
Sure. Well, I'll do it from my perspective and my role with USATF. Again, my role is sports science and medicine, which typically is around medal attainment, right? How do we get these resources to athletes to help them achieve the best they can to win medals? Tokyo's still on the calendar, and all the things that we had in place for Tokyo, we've had to hit the reset button. we're right back where we were. We just don't start making plans. Oh, we got Tokyo in a couple of weeks. Okay, let's figure out what we're going to do. These are 2 years ahead of time or more. We're having discussions, every month with the USOPC for games planning. And now we've hit the reset button and we go back and try to do this all again. And certain things we've actually recalibrated a little bit in terms of, before we were going to have a training camp in Narita. Now we're not going to have a training camp in Narita. There's some nuances there that we've switched and moved around in terms of that sort of planning. On the health and safety side with sports medicine and science, I can tell you that our guidance when we wrote it, we were focused on the time. And what was going on at the time was primarily outdoor track events and road, mountain, ultra trail, race walk type events that took place on the road or on the trail, right? Now we got cross country. Now we got indoors. To give you I literally about 10 days ago got my first call about indoor track. And there's a guy who wants to host an indoor meet in September. And again, we rewrote our guidelines to change the qualifying window to allow times from the summer to potentially qualify for indoors now. So I got people pinging me about, hey, I got this indoor track. Can we have a meet in September? So now we had to say, all right, we need to speed up our thinking and modify and update our guidance, which we've done 2 or 3 times, to now start thinking about cross-country specific and indoor track specific events and what's the right thing to do for those particular facilities, events, to keep people safe, but give them a chance to compete if they can meet the guidelines.
From your, where you sit on the sports performance side and medal attainment is the major goal, is there kind of a time frame that you feel things need to be in place in terms of allowing athletes to compete, to be ready for the Olympic trials and then in turn the Olympic Games? Like, and is
Sure.
there a time where you feel like you're going to start getting nervous that, man, we're cutting it pretty close?
Absolutely. That absolutely comes into play. No question about it. We were looking before. You have to remember, go back to before COVID. If you go back to early, even in 2018, and we're looking at the calendar, we're thinking, all right, we've got an outdoor championships in Doha in October. We've got a world indoor championships in March in China. Our Olympic trials are as early as they've been in a very, very long time. I was talking to, I can't remember who it was, that pretty much every Olympic trials year is the 4th of July. We're celebrating it, wherever the Olympic trials are. This one, the Olympic trials, I think were done by July 1st or June 30th or something like that. The trials date was supposed to end. So now you have all those things in a very narrow time frame. And we spent a lot of time trying to work with coaches on, leading into this with some of our summit meetings, what we call a playbook meeting, where we give them information about Tokyo and World Indoors and things like that. You need to think about that periodization in the calendar and how you're going to make those decisions, right? Well, now it's just reset again. So now it's not so much we have a late World Championships or we still have World Indoors on the calendar. Is that going to go forward? Are people going to make decisions about doing that? They're definitely, the timing and the calculus changes a lot now. And I'm absolutely nervous about making sure we can have our athletes prepared the way we know they can to do the performance they can. The good news is you look at Michael Norman, you look at Noah Lyles, you look at Shelby and some of the marks that they're putting up, and it makes you take a deep breath, right, and relax a little bit and say, you know what, we got the best athletes in the world. They're trained by the best coaches in the world. We're Americans. We'll figure it out, right? We'll be all right.
And where, and is there a point on the calendar where you're like, I really, from kind of a performance perspective, this is where I'd ideally like to see things, quote unquote, back to normal, whatever.
Yeah, you want me to pick a date? Yeah, you want me to pick a date.
And again, this is just from your,
sure,
like, looking at periodization and what you know as a normal cycle for athletes to prepare.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, this is what makes it so tough is that, a lot of it's going to depend on facility access, right? And to give you an idea, the Olympic Training Center that we have in Chula Vista, fantastic facility. A lot of our athletes there still have not returned because at least right now, the weight room is still closed. So they can't get back to that facility because they can't use the weight room. So you start thinking about, distance runners do have the advantage because at least they can go train outside, run on the roads, right? Run on the trails, and they at least have access to that facility, if you want to call it that, to train. Think about a long jumper or a high jumper or a pole vaulter or something like that. And how much of it is just, and this, you guys both do as athletes, from a periodization standpoint, it's not just the 10 weeks before, right? There's the base period leading into it. Do you have access to facilities in those times? And if you miss out on that base period, now what happens? So I don't think it's as easy as picking a single date, because you've got some athletes that say, gosh, I need this 10-week of build up for strength in the weight room, whatever it is, before I even start doing my technical stuff, in a field event or whatever. So it's not just a drop dead date as you get close saying, oh, I need 10 weeks to get ready for the trials. It goes a lot further than that, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Facilities. I mean, access to facilities is a huge part of that whole puzzle. So,
and I think, the reality too is we rely on the university system a lot for access to facilities, and what's going to happen in terms of them opening their campus. I know, at Indiana University, where I'm on the faculty, there's decisions that are going on about what we're going to allow students to do. I can tell you that people I know who live in Bloomington, Indiana, in our community they're really scared. You got 30,000 people again bringing their cooties back into town, and is that going to affect whether facilities open or not as well? And do you prioritize them now for the student population and tell people on the outside in the elite community, I'm sorry, you can't access that? These are things we're working hard with the USOPC and a lot of other people to try to see if we can solve that.
Yeah. Yeah, colleges back in session are going to be a big, kind of a big marker on the calendar to see how things go, I think. And then, the last thing I wanted to ask you, Robert, and again, just from the health and science perspective, as people try to figure these things out and they're looking ahead to next year and trying to figure out how to compete, how to train, they're looking for facilities. They may get to a point where they're saying, hey, I need to take some extra risks to just get some training done or competition done. Are there any recommendations you would leave people as we look ahead?
Certainly. I always tell people the number one thing you can do is the personal decisions you make are what's really driving the spread of this virus. I'm going to give you an example. My wife is one of those immunocompromised people. Since March, she's been in 2 buildings. She's been in our house and she's been in her doctor's office twice, and that's it. I mean, we've left the house, we've gone for walks, we've gone for drives, things like that every day, but she's made really good decisions. And I can tell you her odds of getting the virus are extremely low because of those. And so same thing happens for athletes who are doing this. You've got to really take a deep look. And I'll tell you, there are some people, and you guys tell me what you think on this. Sometimes coaches and athletes and agents and event directors, you get blinders on, right? This is what I do. I train, I put on meets, I coach athletes, and whether COVID or no COVID, this is what I do. You've got to take those blinders off, and you really got to think about all the risks that are out there and the decisions that you're making. If you can keep a social distance, if you can avoid coming into contact with surfaces, if you can use good hygiene, if you do those 3 things, which now includes wear a mask, the odds of getting the virus are going to stay low. Do the best decisions you can, and that's the safest way you can move forward and continue to train and do what you need to do.
Yeah. I think it's a good message for people to take. And I mean, if you're asking our perspective, I know, I think it's, you just, if you're within with yourself, with your family, and you're making your own choices to do whatever you'd like to do with them, I think that's fine. But you do have to take that next level of thought when you step outside of that bubble, and realize, what the others around you that are all kind of now in that scenario.
How are you guys managing all this? I mean, how's everything with FlowTrack going? Okay, you guys doing all right? You guys getting by? How are you doing? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, we're here. We got a podcast off the ground in the midst of all this. So it's I think in so many ways it's a gray area of what the road ahead is, right? And I think that's the challenge, even in listening to kind of what you're saying. In most scenarios, and challenges you face in your life, you say, hey, I just got to get through this time. If it's a test or something at work, project, hey, once I get through this, I get some breathing room. And I think the challenge for most folks right now is you don't know what that marker is, right? And that's where, even for what you're saying, when you take the blinders away, you have to realize, hey, we don't know when it's going to end yet, but the sooner we can all help get it under control, the sooner hopefully we can get things like a track meet back on order. So,
part of the reason I ask is that, and we found very clearly with this that mental health is coming to the forefront on this, right? There's a lot of athletes, a lot of coaches. This is a new stressor in many different ways. And just making sure people have the resources there. We've had to redouble our efforts in that. We always want to do more in the mental health and sports psychology space. We've ramped it up even more, and we're still not, being able to fully do what we need to do. So, things like this hopefully help, right? Having these sort of conversations, hopefully it helps put people at ease and lets them know that, we're really thinking about what's the right way to do things to keep people safe, but try to give them an opportunity to have competitions. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
A lot of people like to bag on USATF at times. I hope people realize the people who work there, I found this out after being there now for 10 years. They care a lot. They're working hard. Sometimes you feel like, the joke I always say is you feel like you're working at the DMV. You could do a really good job, but everybody's always going to hate going to the DMV and dealing with the DMV. But, at the end of the day, you got people who really, really care, really want to do the right things for athletes. And I hope people see it that way.
Yeah, I think one of the things you're starting to touch on when we take the blinders off and we start considering everybody's unique story and having empathy for the other people around you. And I think it's important to have empathy for the athletes that you're competing against, and what they're bringing in their current family situation, but also having empathy again, like you mentioned, like talking, empathy for the support staff, and then ultimately for USATF and the people that are trying to make this meet happen. And we should have empathy because we can clearly see that. Don't worry, guys. USATF looked at every possible way to make this thing happen, and they dove into every possible nuance. And there are a lot of people who have a ton of credentials who care about your health. And so, trust and have empathy that the people around you have your best interests as well. And as soon as we can all accept that, is when we can ultimately, hopefully, move this thing forward and move past it.
Well, I really appreciate you see it that way. That's honestly, you really hit it on the head. We tried everything we could. We care about athletes. We care about coaches. We care about our fans. We wanted to try to do this. We had to do it in a safe way. And ultimately, that's the decision that we made. And we're still going to try to operate and make good decisions moving forward that put the sport and put our athletes first and keep them safe.
Robert, we really appreciate you coming on, especially after a long day of flights of stairs and elevators, I'm sure. We'll let you get back to the time with your son. But again, the perspective that you're able to offer, super interesting, super helpful. Some great stories within it all. And again, just hope you stay safe, your family stays safe,
Same to you.
and we appreciate all your efforts and helping create these guidelines and safety around our sport.
Glad to do it, and it's good to see you again, Ryan. I know it's been too long since we talked. It's good to always talk to you, and hope everything goes well for FlowTrack moving forward.
Yeah, we might have to get another VO2 max test. I don't think I'm quite at the levels I was 12 years ago.
Well, I just want everybody to know, don't go back and watch that video, because I was about 30 pounds heavier back then. So, just I had more hair, but I had a lot more other mass too. So let's just stick with this one. But it's good to talk to you guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Robert. Have a good one.
All right, take care.
So again, that was Robert Chapman at the USATF. I think that was very insightful. I love speaking to Robert because he's a scientist that, I don't know, speaks to me in a way that I feel like I'm going to understand. He often speaks and then I don't understand, but he doesn't sound like he's speaking over my head. So, but
he boils things down and calls them cooties.
Right. But I often find I start saying, I'm glad he's looking into this and not me. So right. That said, I mean, one of the things early on, I asked him about was just kind of the intricacies of our sport. And it just hit me how complicated our sport can be. And, people refer to it sometimes as a 3-ring circus because you have 19, 20 events, a lot of them happening all at once. How do you cover that from a media perspective? There's so many dynamics we're trying to figure out on a daily basis as fans and media companies and people that cover the sport. But then you're not ever thinking about, how does that take effect when there's a pandemic and people's, health and livelihood is at risk? And breaking it down into the different age groups and sectors of the sport, and then the events and implements within just outdoor track and field or indoor track and field, navigating that, just, again, it just hit me in how complicated that was. So I appreciate, just the level of thought that Robert kind of described that they had to go into, and understanding how do we make not just the ability to have this event happen, but how do we make it happen in a way that's low risk, that allows events and meets to actually have that specific discipline at their event.
Right.
So,
yeah, I think like Robert, I love that he's also boots on the ground, right? He's like in the thick of like actually making stuff happen. Like he started talking about like even the logistics of getting testing to the facility and FedExing them and making sure they're not closed on a certain day. It's just like, like we can talk about financials, and yes, they're a beast, and like, but at some point there's also like bandwidth and time. And those are things that you just at some point like just don't exist, right? And you can't just keep stacking it on. And so the bandwidth and the time and like just the logistics of getting testing in is just is unbelievable. But then he gets into the nitty gritty, and I thought it was interesting when he started talking about like dose matters, right? And like, we have these perceptions and like, we see all these guidelines about masks and like 6 feet, but like, hey, what about like when you're exercising and like exercising at the level of some of these athletes are, like your dose that you're putting out is exponentially more. And so like you can't even start putting formulas or equations around what's safe when you start bringing in these kind of like crazy variables to the formula. I thought that was really interesting to hear specifically from him. And then also he mentioned like the exposure, right? Like these athletes are considered like extra exposed, right? And so it's like, again, another exponential value that you have to like try to figure out for in this extremely complicated formula.
Right. Yeah. One of my favorite words or phrases was viral shedding. I was like, that means contagious, I think, right? So, when you look at the USA championships, as he said, it's been going on for over 100 plus years. is something they tried to do. Ultimately from their perspective, there was no way to have that event and have it in a way that wasn't risking people's health, with people traveling in from around the country. Just so there's the health piece, which sounds like it was the ultimate decision. And then on the other side, there's the financial piece, which, whether it was said explicitly or not, obviously weighs into putting on an event, right? Over $500,000 in added cost just on the public health and safety side, in testing and making sure athletes are in separate hotels and extra staff and working with a hospital in case there's an infection that surfaces. So, we're all like trying to figure out how people are putting on events right now. The events themselves are saying, hey, there's extra cost. No one really knows what that all means. Here's one where we kind of said, hey, this is, I think he said around $600,000, and he felt that was conservative. Extra on one event to have.
I mean, and at some point, look, I want to see track and field desperately. I want to see USA Championships, but I'm also like a realist here. Like at some point, it's like, do I feel comfortable justifying that number? Like, do I feel comfortable with like asking somebody to chase that amount of money and to go through those headaches and to like, have athletes go through these exposures, and then also find a bunch of people, like risk a bunch of tests on this event as well. Like, I don't know if like at some point, like I'm a track and field fan, but like part of me is like, am I even comfortable with having a USATF championship in the first place if it's going to cost that much?
Yeah. And again, you put this in the backdrop of a time where, it's a time where the USATF, a big source of revenue is sponsorship, right? A big source of revenue is membership. Membership is based around people signing up to compete in events. Events aren't happening. So without knowing exactly, the financial and the impact, people aren't probably. Are you signing up for USATF membership now for the events that you're running this fall? Well, no, because there's no events.
The ones that aren't happening, right?
So huge added costs in a time where revenues are obviously down for governing NGBs, national governing bodies across the board. So anyway, it was super interesting to hear, and I guess on the other side, just some of those kind of anecdotal stories around the meets, trying to go Jerry's meet and and his team trying to figure out when to come down from altitude. Those are the things that you, as a fan, you don't get to know and see.
Oh man, like I mean, we could debate this all the time. I would love to see the conversation between like the amount of days to hang out a little bit more, and like what's optimal for like coming down from altitude, and like that's the stuff we love to dig into. And I think again, like another story, like, and why I appreciate Robert, because he's like literally on the ground. He started to talk about like the hurdles to get to the Monaco meet. Oh my gosh, like that is such a beast. And just understand like navigating your training and then also navigating that process. And that's just like the very few US athletes that got invited to the meet are all having to go through that. So I thought that was really interesting to hear, just like anecdotally, like this is what it's going to take to get an athlete to compete in a real event at this point. So I think we can all understand kind of the decision tree that the US ATF has gone through. So I appreciate Robert coming on, and I think these are the conversations we like to enable and prop up on this podcast, because it gives people a real understanding about the people who are actually making our sport happen. These are the problems that they are facing every single day, and I think you can see and hopefully have some empathy for the people at USATF who are facing these challenges. So if you appreciate those stories and want to hear more, we appreciate you liking, subscribing, leaving us some reviews on especially the Apple Store, and we appreciate you joining us and putting us in your ears and letting us join you for your run or your commute. And until next time, we'll see you beneath the grandstand.